Good morning. This is Glenn Greenwich and Tom Pope. And the conversation today, there's a lot of turmoil, there's a lot of unrest, and there's a lot of conversation about racism. And the question today is, how do you heal racism? What are some of the thoughts around getting to the source of racism? Tom?
Well, one thought that comes to my mind um, in my third novel, The Violence of Wealth, part of a series of books, alternative history, dealing with a former slave family that uses nonviolent resistance to change things for the better for Americans, for the Black community. Um, I'm dealing in the third book with a lot of economic issues. Economics can control people.
Yes.
However, I'm also thinking of Ta-Nehisi Coates, who has stated that you solve the economic issue, you still haven't solved racism, because maybe this requires a behavioral approach. However, both are tied together. How do we deal with this?
Well, you're absolutely right. They're both tied together, um, maybe sometimes even unconsciously. When I look at housing, for example, and how the government has specifically directed where people live and where homes and projects have been selected to be designed. And when you look at the locations, the locations are usually away from the center of town, away from transportation hubs, making it more difficult to get to a job or to get to an employment or employment hubs. And so you've already established um, the economic with the living situation, and because of that living situation, now um you're caused to do things and behave in a particular manner that is
One example of your comment is in Buffalo, where the Black community has to virtually worry about this large highway just
yeah.
to get from one part of town to the other.
Well, we had that here in New York, when they were putting together the highways, and they would bypass um, uh, minority areas, um, so that there were no off or on ramps in that particular community. So you would have to now drive through another community to even get to the interstates, and the highways. And so this was very divisive in terms of isolating that community economically by
And
access.
it's very possible much of this has occurred because of certain parts of the community making a lot of money to achieve of this. Um, so there is a large economic factor involved. That is,
Absolutely.
but on the other hand, when you take a look at the Greenwood massacre in 1921, you have a thriving Black community with an economic base, and yet racism helps destroy that community. So the economics is separate from the element of racism. So how do we deal with that racism?
Well, Tom, that I mean, I think if we had the answer to that question, we'd be we'd be directing the film and the cameras from a different angle. But the truth about it is, for me, that it's so ingrained and so very subtle that sometimes it's overlooked as just pure economics, and the institutionalization of the racism isn't quite as evident as it was when the water fountain was for whites only, or something to that, you know, to that manner. You know, you can't eat here, or you can't be served here. So it's much more subtle now. So it's not so much that you're not, that there's a sign that says you're not welcome, but when you walk in, you don't get that welcome vibe. So that in itself will limit you coming back, or and you may even tell your friends, well, you know, I went there and the place wasn't very friendly towards me. And so now you've got a whole nother way of being that is racially motivated, um, and it's not technically, you know, seemingly uh, uh, connected with the economics, but economics has a play in it, you know.
In my third book, my character Yui um, tries to deal with changing a behavioral mentality in people. And he does this by using elements of conflict resolution. He works with Ellen Gurley Flynn, a very early socialist activist. And with her, they develop these concepts of conflict resolution where they try to have people connect with each other to get beyond problems in the past, to come together and solve a problem as allies today. How do we work together jointly? And many of these people are still facing the same issues, like the Trump base is facing the fear of losing their status or their jobs to a Black or Latino population. How do we change that mentality so they see themselves as working with the Black and Latino community against a common foe who is trying to control them? So is it possible? With my example, Yui doesn't see the target of his approach as the real extremist. The target is the people who are not quite extremist, but could be won over. And maybe it's possible to drop that 34% of people who we think of as being hardcore racist. Maybe it's less than that. And maybe we could attract some of those into a joint cause.
Well, you know, I think that the first thing, Tom, is that we've got to look at not coming from a scarcity. And I think that when scarcity is involved, economic scarcity, access to the economics, when people can begin to feel comfortable that there's enough for everybody, that initial fear that I need to get there before you do disappears, and there then can become some co-creation or even partnership in terms of let's get there together. But until
We come back to the violence of wealth.
yeah, yeah, because wealth inherently is that I have the power and you don't, and I'm going to keep it from you. And that whole dynamics sets up this fear, sets up this conflict that creates the violence.
This idea of creating an environment where there isn't a scarcity. I address that in my third novel as Yui is trying to fight the banking industry and sets up co-ops, credit unions. The banking industry is able to counter that. So Yui then comes up with community funds, another currency. You work at a factory that's a co-op and are paid in CFs, community funds. You take that to your supermarket or your grocery and you buy what you want because they're part of a network.
Right.
The banking industry cuts down on that. So how does Yui respond? He responds to create that atmosphere of lack of scarcity by bringing people together and having, for example, union offices that are suddenly open to people who are evicted, or they find apartment buildings or housing that is vacant and use that. They make connections with farmers in the rural areas for supplies, and everyone is sharing in a commonality to bring together what you're talking about, the idea that things are not scarce. We can share and work together.
Yeah, and I think that in the essence is how did you combat racism? You know, there's a, when I'm different, then I can be hateful, but when we're the same, I'm hurting myself as well as hurting you. So there's that, you know, we talked about the behavioral aspects of who we're being and what we're up to. And until that economic piece gets resolved, I don't know that the racism will soften until that economic bridge is the gap has been filled.
Where do we go from here?
Well, I think part of it is just the conversations, you know, having these kind of dialogues, understanding what really is at stake. And for me, the truth about economics, you know, there is a plentifulness that's available as opposed to scarcity. But people have to believe that's so, and change, you know, change the behavioral thoughts about, you know, crabs in a barrel. You know, you know, I got to get it before you, or I can't allow you to achieve and not let me achieve. But if we work together, everybody gets out the barrel. So,
Well, if you like what you see, contact us through Community and Social Change on Facebook.
thank you.